I'll be talking about the relationship between the urban farm and the BRTS transit use, a case of Ahmedabad. This is the content of the presentation, which I'll be explaining. So what happens is, because of the increase in personal usage, a lot of negative externalities such as uh, bad air pollution or those kind of externalities come up because of the personal vehicle use. So a development of an efficient public transportation system was thought to be a need. So many of the Indian cities which have been mentioned over here have been taken up bus transit solutions like BRTA systems and have been implementing them in their cities, which help in mobility and to alleviate the impacts of rising congestions in the city. To understand the factors that affect these kind of transit ridership becomes a very important factor to understand the success of any of the transit systems. Previous studies, through case studies, we have also seen that a relationship exists between certain PRTS, certain riderships and the urban forms, and seeing all the previous case studies and urban forms, we see that there are 6 kinds of urban forms which relate to the BRTS ridership. They are called as density, diversity, design, destination accessibility, and distance to transit and demand management. Because of the time constraints, we'll be only looking at the variables of density and diversity in this project. So the aim of this study was to see whether a relationship between the urban forms and the BRTS transit ridership exists in Ahmedabad. So for that, the objective was to see whether the urban form variables of density and diversity relate to BRTS ridership in Ahmedabad's locations, and to analyze whether those relationships of urban form and BRTS ridership in the selected areas do correlate with each other or not. And then to analyze whether those relationships of the BRTS riders and their residential typologies correlate with each other. Looking at the transit ridership, looking at different kinds of literature review, we see that most of the studies take up average weekday or monthly or annual boardings to take up as the ridership values in these kind of studies. And weekday boardings were taken as people start only, only the transit work to commute journeys were taken up into consideration as people start on the return journey, on the return trip on the same place that they ended. So just taking up borders was enough, taking into consideration borders. Looking at the urban forms of density and diversity were taken up. So the urban forms of density is always always measured as a variable of interest per unit area, and the effects of density on travel demand have been long acknowledged through previous researches. Higher densities are associated with more public transport use, more walkable and cycling, and less use of car. So in Ahmedabad's context, the parameters that under density were used were taken up as population density and dwelling unit density. The population density was taken up as because of the way Ahmedabad has grown, because of the morphological makeup of the city. And the dwelling unit density, as we do not have multifamily or single family units, so housing typologies like residential and commercial typologies were taken up into consideration in the density part of it. And when looking at the diversity part, the land use balance or the entropy values were taken up into consideration, as Ahmedabad has prevalent mixed land use in its development, and vertical mix is also taken up into consideration when you take up the formula of entropy or the land use diversity. So these were the kind of indicators that were studied upon. In density, the housing typology, a plotted development or an apartment type, slum, gamtals or chawls were taken into consideration. And for diversity, the entropy value, which takes into consideration the categories of residential, commercial, mixed land use and others. Now, if we see that the current debates on TOD, in Ahmedabad itself, we have a TOD zone, which is around 400 meters from the, linearly from the station areas. And over there, the FSI of 4 has been given up, granted to it. What happens is this kind of development is given to increase the density, to change the urban form, to allow a lot of people with mixed land use and high rises to come up and settle over there, and they would be the primary or the sole users of the BRTS. So that's how the TOD zone has been taken up. But in actuality, if we even take up the case study of Curitiba, what happens is if a transit-oriented development zone has been given, the land values of that particular area, they go up. The cost of the infrastructure then to provide infrastructure to that area, it goes up even more higher. So there is a pressure on the developers to recover these expenses. So what the developers do is they try and create higher floor space areas, which are only then affordable to higher income group people. Lower income group people who actually do generally use the BRTS are pushed even more aside. So this study is trying to sort of understand what are the current users of BRTS in Ahmedabad, whether they are these HIG people living in higher floor place areas or lower income groups living in low floor place areas. This is a general introduction of the Janmarg BRTS system in Ahmedabad. If we see that the ridership levels have been increasing since its initiation in 2009, where right now if we see an average number of 135,000 passengers ride the BRTS daily. So understanding how exactly, what kind of a background do these people come from is very essential to understanding the BRTS systems or to even increase such a system. For the stop area, an influence zone of 400-meter radius was taken up into consideration, as most of the studies show that if more than 400-meter radius is present, people do not walk from such far off distances towards the BRTS railway station, BRTS station. So different locations in Ahmedabad were taken up. These locations were based on high ridership area stations, and they were not calculated as transfer stations, as transfer stations would have other dynamics working into its working. That's why only stations which are not transfer stations were selected. These were the stations that were taken up, which was Akbar Nagar, Dharnidar Derasar, and Isanpur in Ahmedabad, which have high ridership areas. So this was the kind of analysis that was then done based on the density, the building use, the entropy value of it, and the FSI which was currently used on it, and correlated with the higher ridership areas. So if we correlate these three relations, the building typology, which was mostly plotted development or apartment type of development, have certain high correlations towards higher ridership areas, and building uses such as commercial uses or residential uses have a little bit of a significance towards, they have a little bit of an association towards the ridership part of it. So looking at the building typologies, I went ahead and we did a total survey of 120 BRTS borders to establish whether the transit ridership profile of the people using it on the basis of three categories: socioeconomic profile, the travel characteristic, and the housing typology profile. If you look at the socioeconomic profile of the people, around 47% of the persons that use the BRTS belong to a lower income group, which ranges from around 5,000 to 20,000 rupees per month. And the travel profile also, if we look at it, around 57% of the people who were using those BRTS stops did come from 200-meter radius. And around 78% of the people came from the 400-meter radius, so it sort of proves the before part. And as strong correlations were observed previously between the residential typology profile and the BRTS riders, we asked the people during the surveys from what kind of housing typologies do they come from. A staggering number of 76% of the people who used the BRTS came from apartment type of buildings. These apartment types of buildings, if we see, a lot of people came from 2 BHK apartments and 1 BHK apartments. And when asked about their areas, they came from around 750 to 1,000 square meter kind of areas. And we even tried to understand the kind of parking provisions that the housing typologies had. The basis for it was if there is allotted parking in the premises, then a resident is likely to not use a BRTS and to use his own private vehicle. So the chances of him using the public transport is less. So he does not become a target group. But if there is no allotted parking in the premises, maybe the resident would be not use his own vehicle and use the BRTS. So he may be a target group. So looking at that, sorry, actually there's a slide missing over here, which actually showed that, which actually showed that a lot of people who came from these kind of apartment buildings did not have allotted parkings. Around 70% of the people did not have allotted parkings. And so depending upon it, we even found out whether there are strong correlations between the housing typologies and the socioeconomic variables and the travel characteristics. This was the table of it, in which we can see is that housing typologies have a very strong correlation with the area of residence, which we found out to be an averagely of 750 to 1,000 square meters. It has somewhat of a moderate kind of a correlation with the number of rooms that are present in it, which we found out was 1 BHK or 2 BHK kind of apartments. The housing typologies have, again, a somewhat moderate relationship with the tenure, a tenure which was an important consideration, where 50% of the people came from living as renters and 50% of them were owners. And the income groups, as we saw earlier, have small correlationships with the housing typologies, with the income groups of 5,000 to 20,000 per month coming up, and vehicular ownership, where people did really own one of the two-wheelers, but then there was no allotted parking present within the premises of the building. And when we even saw the mode choice, a strong correlation exists between the mode choice and the distance that was traveled by the people. So people preferred to walking lower than 400-meter radius distance. A small correlation was seen between the time taken and the mode choice. So walking was again preferred because they would reach the stop in less than 5 minutes. And age and gender, if we saw, then it was around that the age group of 16 to 60 was present. Males as well as females preferred walking towards the railway station. So the conclusion would be was that at the station area level, the urban form variables of density as well as diversity have an impact on the BRTS transit ridership, positive and strong relations as we have seen before. And the building typologies have strong correlations to the transit ridership. Residents from certain building typologies are the target group. If transit ridership is to be increased, then this target group can be allowed to live near the transit stops. This target group being the residents who live in apartment type of building having no allotted parkings. And if this kind of development that allows a typical BRTS rider to accommodate that zone is promoted, then there would be a more probability of increasing the BRTS ridership in Ahmedabad. Thank you.